Most people do not have an income problem first. They have an engine problem. They wake up, sell 8 or 10 hours, collect a paycheck, pay bills, calm themselves with small comforts, and call that progress. Then they stare at an investment account that moves so slowly it feels insulting. A few $1,000s up, a few $1,000s down. Nothing that changes the way they breathe. Nothing that changes the way they walk into a room. Nothing that lets them tell a bad boss. No, I have spent my life studying capital allocation, and I can tell you something most people do not want to hear. Your life does not change when you learn one more market fact. It changes when your money stops behaving like stored labor and starts behaving like a productive engine. That transition does not happen smoothly. It happens at thresholds. There are points where the machine wakes up, where it starts pulling real weight, and where it finally begins to change your relationship with fear. If you miss those thresholds, you will think wealth building is boring, weak, and painfully slow. If you understand them, you will see why so many disciplined people look ordinary for years and then suddenly become very difficult to push around. I am not talking about fantasy. I am not talking about crypto miracles, lottery wins, or pretending every growth stock is destiny. I am talking about simple arithmetic, repeated behavior, and the brutal difference between linear effort and compounding force. Most people think the first $100,000 means you are 10% of the way to 1 million. That is the kind of statement that sounds sensible and keeps people poor. It sounds sensible because human beings think in straight lines. Work 1 hour, get paid for 1 hour, save $1, get $1 closer, make 10% progress, be 10% done. That logic works fine in a job. It works terribly in capital. Capital does not grow like a staircase. It grows like an engine that spends a long time coughing, rattling, and barely moving before the cylinders finally catch. If you do not understand that, you will quit during the ugliest phase of the entire process. You will stop feeding the machine right before it becomes useful. Let me make this plain. Take an ordinary working adult. Not a hedge fund manager. Not a founder who sold a company. Just a person who decides to put away $500 a month and invest it at a long-run average return of around 7% a year. That number is not magic. It is not heroic. It is simply the kind of disciplined, boring adult behavior that our culture treats as too slow right before it quietly changes a life. At that pace, the first $100,000 takes roughly 7 years. That is where the modern mind rebels. 7 years sounds obscene to a population that can summon groceries in half an hour and buy a dopamine hit with a thumb swipe. People hear 7 years and think the machine is broken. They think the return is weak. They think they need a hotter stock, a cleverer strategy, a shortcut, a secret circle, a private Discord, a younger face on a screen saying the old rules are dead. No, what is dead is your attention span. The early years are slow because in the beginning you are the engine. That is the part most people do not understand. In the first phase, your account is not carrying you. You are carrying it. Your deposits are the pistons. Your discipline is the fuel pump. Your restraint is the pressure. The money in the account is still too small to do much real labor on its own. That is why the first 100,000 feels so emotionally unfair. You are working in two worlds at once. You are working at your job, and then you are working again in silence by not spending what the culture begs you to spend. You are declining dinners you can afford but should not normalize. You are driving the car a little longer. You are ignoring the little voice that says you deserve a visible reward for invisible progress. You are building torque nobody can clap for. That is why this phase is so psychologically violent. It exposes whether you are controlled by the outer scorecard or the inner scorecard. The outer scorecard asks a simple question: does your life look richer yet? The inner scorecard asks the only question that matters: is the engine stronger than it was last year? Those are not the same question. A weak mind chases proof. A strong allocator chases power. At roughly 100,000, something important happens. You are still not free. Do not romanticize it. You are not floating around on passive income and declining every invitation that annoys you, but the machine is no longer asleep. At that point, with a $500 monthly contribution and a 7% return assumption, about $46,000 or so came from your own contributions, and the rest came from growth. Read that again. By the time you hit 6 figures, a large chunk of the account exists because money started helping money. That is the ignition point. It is not freedom. It is ignition. Most people make a catastrophic mistake at exactly this stage. They look at 100,000 and say, that took forever. They do not realize they have completed the hardest mechanical phase of the entire journey. They confuse the pain of ignition with the permanent nature of the process. That is like spending years building an aircraft runway, finally getting the wheels moving, and then slamming the brakes because the climb did not happen in the first 5 seconds. If you stop at 100,000, you do not lose only the next deposits. You lose the behavior pattern, the accumulated discipline, and the future years in which the engine would have started carrying real mass. From there, the math changes in a way that humbles anyone still thinking linearly. The move from 0 to 100,000 takes nearly 8 years under that simple example. The move from 100,000 to 200,000 takes about 5 more. That is the first lap. It took almost 8 years to build the first floor of the machine, not because you suddenly became a genius, but because the machine now has internal force. It is no longer waiting for your deposits alone. It is taking your deposits and multiplying the effect of your patience. At roughly 200,000, the account begins to feel different on a human level. Not because you are rich, but because the ratio has changed. More and more the balance is there because the system is working. If you have stayed consistent, your contributions will be far lower than the total account value, which means the invisible workforce inside the machine is getting larger. That is the part ordinary people never see coming. They think wealth is built by becoming more exhausted. In truth, real wealth begins when exhaustion stops being the only source of motion. Then comes one of the most important transitions in a person's financial psychology. Keep the same simple discipline, keep feeding the machine, keep refusing to break the rhythm every time the world offers a reason to panic or celebrate. Around year 18 in that example, you can be near $400,000. Now stop and think about what that means. At 7%, $400,000 throws off roughly $28,000 a year in growth on average. I want you to feel the violence of that sentence. $28,000. That is not the result of you waking up earlier. That is not from asking your boss for a larger slice of a budget somebody else controls. That is not from commuting farther, smiling harder, or becoming more efficient at living inside a system that rents your time by the hour. That is capital beginning to do adult work. This is where many people finally understand the central insult of the employee trap. The employee trap is not employment itself. I have nothing against employment. It is the belief that labor alone is enough, and that capital can remain an afterthought. That trap keeps people strong enough to earn but too weak to resist. If every dollar of security in your life depends on your next paycheck, then your income is not an asset. It is a breathing requirement. Once your machine starts throwing off real annual growth, your whole nervous system begins to change. You panic less, you posture less, you tolerate nonsense less, you stop calling every inconvenience an emergency, because the machine has begun to create cushion between you and chaos. That leads to the second threshold, the point where the engine's torque starts to alter your life, not just your spreadsheet. For many households, that number sits around $650,000 in invested assets. I am not saying $650,000 means you are finished. I am not selling fairy tales. I am telling you there is a level where the machine becomes too large to ignore. At an 8% return, $650,000 can generate roughly $52,000 in a year. Now that does not fully replace a median household income, and to replace something closer to $78,000, you would need something closer to $975,000 at that same rate. But $650,000 does something that may be even more important than replacement. It shrinks fear. That is the torque point. When the machine can produce $40, $50, maybe more $1,000 a year in productive output, you stop living with the same fragility. Losing a job does not feel like falling off a cliff. It feels like a problem to solve. A medical scare still hurts, but it does not immediately become a financial execution order. A bad quarter at work feels unpleasant, not apocalyptic. You gain what I consider one of the most valuable assets in modern life: refusal power. Refusal power is the ability to say no without your whole financial structure trembling. No to the boss who wants to buy your weekends. No to the client who wants to insult you and call it urgency. No to the relocation you know will poison your family life. No to the business model you hate, but keep defending because you are undercapitalized. Most people do not understand how much of their personality is rented from their fear. They call themselves practical when they are cornered. They call themselves loyal when they are dependent. They call themselves realistic when they are simply underpowered. The machine changes that. Once the engine has real torque, your relationship with risk becomes more rational. Notice I did not say reckless, I said rational. That distinction matters. Poorly capitalized people are often told to take bigger risks. That is stupid advice. Fragile people do not need more risk first, they need more buffer. But once productive assets begin covering a meaningful portion of your life, You can take selected risks from strength instead of desperation. You can learn a new skill without needing that skill to save you in 90 days. You can start a business without asking one weak month to justify the whole leap. You can move toward work with dignity instead of clinging to work with panic. You can stop postponing every meaningful desire until an imaginary retirement age when your energy may be lower. Your courage weaker and your body less cooperative. This is where wealth stops being about visible consumption and starts becoming about silent control. The world trains you to admire spending because spending is easy to display. The engine teaches you to admire optionality because optionality is the first real sign of power. There is another subtle transformation at the torque point. You stop treating time as a cheap substance. Most workers are trained to think in wages. If you earn more per hour, you assume you are winning. That is a shallow form of math. The more useful question is whether your capital is beginning to buy back your life. The whole point of this machine is not to produce bragging rights. It is to convert some of your future time from employer-owned time into self-directed time. That is why the 650,000 threshold matters so much. It may not make you independently wealthy, but it starts making the system negotiable. There is a huge emotional difference between needing your job and choosing your job. There is an even bigger difference between needing every paycheck and being able to absorb the loss of one. That is why people at this stage often look calmer. It is not always because they are nicer. Sometimes it is because they are no longer spiritually hostage. Then comes the seven-figure threshold. $1 million still captures the public imagination because round numbers have power over the human mind. But the number itself is not the deepest reason it matters. Inflation has already done its quiet work. $1 million today does not buy the psychological fantasy it once did. So if you worship the number, you will misunderstand it. The real importance of the first $1 million is not social. It is mechanical and psychological. It is the sovereignty point. Under that same simple example, with $500 a month and a 7% annual return, you can reach $1 million in roughly 29 years. 29 years is long enough for people to either become disciplined adults or remain emotional children with better electronics. The years will pass either way. At $1 million, something important happens inside your head. You stop asking whether the method works. That question is dead. Now the machine answers the method works. That validation is more powerful than most people realize. For years, the culture whispers that only insiders win, only lucky people get ahead, only people with inheritances matter, only market geniuses compound real wealth. Then you cross 7 figures as an ordinary disciplined investor, and you see the truth. The market did not require genius. It required consistency, tolerance for boredom, and immunity to social pressure. That realization is liberating. It proves that wealth is not reserved for the loudest man in the room. Often it goes to the person who can keep feeding the engine while everyone else keeps interrupting their own progress. At $1 million, even modest return assumptions begin to feel substantial in a way that changes your sense of scale. Depending on market conditions, interest rates, and your portfolio structure, your assets can generate $40,000 to $50,000 a year or more. Again, that is not private island money. It is something much more useful. It is evidence that the engine has become real enough to protect you from total dependence. And that is where they coast. They get the million, feel relief, and start treating the engine like a trophy instead of a machine. That is foolish. The first million is not the end of the game. It is the point where the game begins to tilt hard in your favor. From there, the next increases become more mathematically tractable. 1.5 million requires a 50% increase. 2 million requires a doubling from 1. Historically, with enough time, diversified productive assets do that kind of work. The move from 2 to 3 requires a smaller percentage gain than the move from 1 to 2. The move from 3 to 4 becomes easier still. This is why the people who truly understand capital become more disciplined, not less. After the first 7 figures, they understand that each dollar now has employees inside it. They understand that every wasteful decision is not just today's pleasure. It is future engine capacity surrendered. They understand that the expensive dinner is not only $200 gone, it is also whatever that $200 could have become inside a productive system over years and decades. You do not need to become a monk to respect that truth. You do need to stop lying to yourself. Most financial failure in the middle class is not caused by one giant disaster. It is caused by 1,000 little moments where present appetite defeats future control. The machine does not ask you to hate life. It asks you to stop leaking it. Now let me tell you something else that separates serious builders from dabblers. You cannot think about this engine only in up markets. Everybody feels intelligent when the screen is green. Everybody wants to claim they are a long-term investor when the number is climbing. The real test comes when the market falls, when headlines get theatrical, when recession predictions multiply like insects, and when your account balance looks smaller than it did a few months earlier. That is when the machine reveals whether you understand it or whether you are only using it as entertainment. A downturn does not automatically destroy a disciplined builder. In many cases, it helps him because the same contribution buys more productive assets. Lower prices are only frightening to people who plan to quit the process or who never understood why they were buying in the first place. The market crash is not always the enemy of the disciplined accumulator. Often it is the discount counter that emotional people run from. That does not mean you should be naive. Diversification matters, valuation matters, fees matter, taxes matter. Withdrawal discipline matters. If you build the engine poorly, you will get poor output. If you treat speculation like investing, the machine becomes a casino. If you overpay for complexity, the machine wastes energy and friction. But none of that changes the central lesson: the thresholds are real. The first 100,000 matters because that is where your money stops being dead weight and begins to ignite. 650,000 matters because that is where the output starts changing your emotional life and your bargaining power. 1 million matters because that is where you finally feel, in your bones, that capital can stand beside labor instead of kneeling behind it. This is not only about retirement. Frankly, I think too many people use retirement language as a disguise for something deeper. What they really want is not endless leisure. They want relief from dependence. They want enough machine power to stop living under permanent low-grade coercion. That is a more intelligent goal. A person with a strong engine may still work very hard. I certainly did. The difference is that work becomes expression, not choice replaces compulsion. Long-term thinking replaces monthly survival. There is also a moral dimension here that people rarely discuss. Honestly, when you do not build your own engine, someone else's engine becomes the organizing force of your life. Their quarterly targets shape your calendar. Their debt shapes your stress. Their incentives shape your behavior. Their definition of urgent becomes your blood pressure. You become fuel in a system you do not own. Then call yourself responsible because you keep showing up. I would rather you face the truth. If you refuse to build capital, you are volunteering for fragility. You are choosing a life where one employer, one illness, one layoff, one bad year in your industry, or one bout of emotional spending can throw your whole structure off balance. You can call that normal if you want. I call it expensive. Here is the good news. The engine does not require perfection. It does not require brilliance. It does not require you to predict the next technology cycle or identify some hidden 10-bagger before the crowd sees it. It requires three things most people consistently avoid. First, it requires a contribution habit strong enough to survive your moods. Second, it requires enough patience to let compounding do work your ego cannot speed up. Third, it requires a refusal to confuse entertainment with capital allocation. Those sound simple because they are simple. They are just not easy in a culture built to monetize your impulses. The culture wants you liquid, distracted, performative, and slightly insecure. That person spends better. The engine requires the opposite. It requires steadiness, delayed applause, lower noise, and a deeper loyalty to future freedom than present display. That is why wealth is psychological before it becomes numerical. You are not only building a portfolio, you are building an identity that can hold a long horizon without fidgeting. At first, nobody notices. Then a few years pass and your engine reaches ignition. More years pass and it develops torque. Still more pass and the machine reaches sovereignty. From the outside, people call it luck or timing or privilege because they did not watch the quiet years. They did not see the dinners skipped, the boredom tolerated, the contributions automated, the crashes endured, the nonsense ignored. They only see the output and assume it appeared. It did not appear. It was built. That is what I want you to understand. Not the glamour of 1 million, not the vanity of a round number, not the fantasy that one day you will wake up transformed by a market miracle. I want you to understand the engine. I want you to see why the first 100,000 feels slow and why that slowness is not evidence against the method. I want you to see why 650,000 can alter your breathing before it alters your biography. I want you to see why 1 million is not the finish line, but the moment your machine becomes big enough to make your future substantially more negotiable. Most of all, I want you to stop insulting your future self by demanding immediate fireworks from a system designed for accumulated force. You do not plant an orchard and scream at it in year 2. You do not build a factory and judge it before the machinery is installed. You do not build a wealth engine and call it useless before it has enough internal power to move on its own. The tragedy is not that compounding is slow. The tragedy is that most people quit at the exact point where slow was about to become meaningful. Now the door is in front of you. You can keep living in the salary reflex where every month begins at 0 and every problem feels larger because your capital is too small to help you. Or you can begin the long adult process of building an engine that one day changes the way you think. Negotiate and endure. The next 7 years are going to pass. The next 18 are going to pass. The next 29 are going to pass. The only question is whether, when those years arrive, you will still be the engine for everything in your life, or whether you will finally have built one that can stand beside you. That is the test. Not whether you know the jargon, not whether you feel motivated tonight, not whether you can impress anyone with a financial opinion. The test is whether you are willing to feed a machine long enough for it to free you. Most people will not. You still can.